Good morning. I'm just making some porridge again. One of the funny things I find about this particular activity, but activities like this generally, is that the materials that I'm working with, in this case porridge, start to pick up some of the, I know it sounds nuts, but they start to pick up some of the significance of whatever it is I'm talking about. So it starts to stand there. I start to think with the materials as well as, I don't know if that makes any sense. In practical terms, what this means for you is that at some point in the future you'll probably see a video of me either in the rabbit ears or something like that involving porridge. Because when I look at the porridge as I'm stirring it, I guess because I tend to be talking about consciousness right now in these videos, it looks a little bit like brains to me, as this I imagine brains to be, and I've never actually seen a brain. So for me, all these ideas that I'm kicking around with to do with consciousness and porridge are kind of fused in my head. So if I ever do make that video of sitting at the table with porridge on my face, you'll know where that's come from. In my head, it won't be evident in the video, and I apologise for that, but in my head, that porridge will be a kind of stand-in for a whole bunch of ideas to do with consciousness and thinking and cognition and belief and so on. Anyhow, the bit of consciousness that I'm thinking of today actually is it's to do with prayer, I think. Prayer. Because I made a video a couple of weeks ago, and I've been reading up on the same subject matter since, to do with evangelical religions. I think that my video is called something like When God Doesn't Talk Back, but in it I was citing this book called When God Talks Back, which was a really great book actually. I can't remember the name of the writer now, it's completely gone. It'll come back to me. I'll put it in the description box anyway. It's from a writer who did a kind of anthropological study, I guess you'd call it, some field work amongst an evangelical sect or group in the United States called the Vineyard Movement, or the Vineyard Community, something like that. They're kind of like a Jesus Army, very youth oriented, very kind of hip, if you like, that kind of thing. Christian group, very happy slappy, not terribly politically active, certainly not active in kind of the fundamentalist end of that stuff, but very kind of inward looking, or at least very concerned with the experience of religion and the experience of the presence of God, and if you like, one of the main themes of this particular group is the experienced presence of God in their lives, which is fascinating, because it's quite difficult to do that. I think one of the other themes of that particular book is just stressing how difficult it is to create that sense. And one of the problems, if you like, that evangelicals or believers of any kind face is, how do you, in a secular society and in a society where even the mass is usually said in English rather than Latin, there's very little mystery to produce that kind of woo feeling, which is a precursor perhaps to other kinds of experiences. In that kind of society, how do you feel this presence if you want to do that? And the Vineyard community basically do that by prayer. Their prayer for this community is a kind of technology, the technology of the sacred, you might say, a means of finding God. And they also do other exercises, spiritual exercises, like Loyola's spiritual exercises, you probably know that. So they're very involved in that. And the way it's really interesting the way they choose to do it, which it leads me to think of several things, which I'll try and put all in the same video. I mean, but the way they do it is through a kind of, I guess you would call it meditation. Their prayer is a form of meditation, but it's prayer and meditation, not in the sense of making a wish. It's not kind of intercessionary prayer and that kind of stuff. It's a kind of prayer which is a form of listening, and for them it's a listening to the contents of their own consciousness, kind of. Because what the thinking behind it is, which is expressed in this book, is that we all of us have these voices inside our head. Well, we don't have voices inside our head exactly, but we have lots of things going on in our lives, right, in our heads all the time. We have perceptions and memories and hopes and fears and desires, and we kind of reenact conversations we've had that we should have gone better, and we anticipate conversations we're about to have. And you know, there's this cacophony of thoughts in our head, kind of like little voices talking to one another, right? And we all have that. And what the task for the Vineyard community is to identify within all that cacophony inside their head a particular voice. They've got a kind of theory of mind, is how the author describes it. They have a theory of mind, which is non-conventional, but it's a theory nonetheless, which kind of articulates this idea that amongst that cacophony of noise inside your head, there is a quiet voice, and that's the voice of God, they say. And as I say, the task of prayer, the task of listening and meditation, is to identify that voice. And once they've identified it, which they claim to be able to do, and hear it as a kind of separate voice from the rest of the cacophony, the process is one of not exactly externalizing it, but discriminating it from the rest of the babble that fills our heads all the time. It's almost, and this is not how they put it, this is just my way of thinking of it right now, it's almost as if they're rewinding that that breakdown of consciousness that Julian Jaynes talks about in the bicameral mind, even, which is may well be wrong anyway. But you know, that idea that at one time in the past we had these two parts to our heads, the part which was kind of wise and could make good choices perhaps, or at least could narrate the world in a different way than our normal consciousness does, and that used to talk to us, and now that broke down in Jaynes, so we've only got one consciousness. In a sense, the Vineyard group seem to be involved, or one way of looking at it is a kind of a refinding of that second voice, a re-establishing of a kind of bicameral mind, so that you know, as I say, and amongst that cacophony you do hear that quiet voice, the voice of God. Now, of course, as soon as you say hearing voice inside your head, or hearing the voice of God particularly, that conjures up all kinds of images to do with mental illness, schizophrenia, Abraham and Isaac, you know, where the voice of God tells them to kill his son. All those kind of things come up, at least for me, perhaps because I'm an atheist. But it's not that they're talking about. I think it's an important distinction to make. The voice of God that they're talking about isn't the voice that certain sufferers of schizophrenia perhaps claim, and it's not the authorial voice that's at least notionally present in some of the Old Testament. It's a different thing. So I just find that really interesting. I mean, I'd certainly like to be able to unweave some of the tangled rainbow of ideas that's in my head. You know, and maybe there are some disciplines, maybe not necessarily that one, some disciplines which do allow you to listen to the different kinds of things that's going on in your head, and to make some distinctions. You know, I'd like to be able to distinguish a wiser voice inside my head, or a more compassionate voice perhaps, and maybe decide whether I want to elevate that to a more prominent position. That sounds like potentially quite a useful thing to be able to do. But several things come out of that for me. The Vineyard stuff that in this book, When God Talks Back, and the kind of idea that that's part of our psychological toolbox, that we may be able to go in there and do some carding, you know, like carding in a cotton mill. I used to work in a cotton mill when I first left school. And one of the things we used to do is carding machines, which comb the fibres straight. Perhaps as a way of carding. That might be quite a nice thing to do. But several things for me. Because part of me, of course, when I hear about the Vineyard group, or similar kinds of group like the Jesus Army, and the kind of processes that you go to, I immediately get this indoctrination. And it reminds me of those other kinds of processes like neuro-linguistic programming, or I don't know, there's a whole bunch of those kind of thought realignment techniques which always smack of brainwashing, and I've got a bit of a no-no about, quite rightly. But then I think, hang on a second, do any of us have a natural consciousness that is not carded in some way, not affected by a theory of mind implicit in whatever processes we go through? You know, because even if it seems to me that even if we don't go through some kind of orderly process of prayer and meditation and spiritual exercises to familiarise ourselves with the content of our minds such that we experience consciousness in a different way, even if we don't go through that orderly process as adults in the way that the Vineyard group do, something similar happens to that in childhood, doesn't it? You know, because we don't just naturally come into the world speaking and having all these kind of mind kind of relationships. We learn it from the moment we're born. We start, don't we, naming things, and we're encouraged to name things in certain ways, and we're encouraged to form sentences in certain ways, just in language terms. We're encouraged to draw things in certain ways. Quite interested in drawing at the moment. And unless you went to a Steiner school, then the earliest drawings you did, just like the earliest drawings I did, were probably pictures of mum and dad, which are rendered as bounded objects on a two-dimensional surface, you know, with circles marking the difference between that which is not dad and that which is dad. Bounded figure. You know, these are kind of theories of mind, aren't they? I've thought. Learning how to speak, learning how to adopt the myths of our tribe, which essentially the myths of our tribe are kind of post-enlightenment autonomous individuals, aren't we? That's kind of how we see ourselves. Learning what a self is, listening to the voice of ourself, which is the voice that I seem to be talking in all the bloody time these days. So it seems to me that, no, while we're not going through this indoctrination process of the Vineyard group or the Jesus Army or whatever, just becoming alive and awake in a culture, being thrown into this world with all the things that go on, learning how to be yourself in this world, is you know, the practical aspects of a theory of mind, isn't it? The practical manifestation of that. And here we are practicing what a mind is like in the West in the 21st century, with all the normalcy that comes with that. Completely normal and highly theorised at the same time. So yeah, so that's what I'm thinking about with that. There was something else. Oh yeah, I suppose I was just going to think about psychology, but only for a minute, because it's tempting, as I say, because I am who I am, and I had the indoctrination that I had, if you want to call it that. I learnt the prayers of my tribe early, and have been reciting them for 57 years nearly. And it's a prayer which has self and has a bounded figure in a landscape, just like the drawings I used to do when I was 3. And it's full of the named objects which make up my world, all those kind of things. It's tempting to say, well, this is just about psychology, isn't it? It's just about psychology. That's nothing to do with the real world, it's about psychology. But psychology itself, it seems to me, as popularly understood at least in most of the branches of psychology, is itself built into that myth structure, isn't it? You know, we think of psychology as a series of sciences, maybe, or humanities practices, if not, to do with, you know, what goes on inside people's heads. I'm not saying that's not important, but there you go, isn't it? I mean, that's exactly it, what goes on inside people's heads. Psychology is a thing that takes place inside that little circle, that roughly drawn circle with the word dad scrawled above it on a piece of paper. That's where the psychology happens, in there. Everything else is something else. But there are definitions of psychology which don't do that, aren't there? And I'm not talking about woo, weird quantum bullshit psychology. I'm talking about, you know, proper legitimate stuff. Like the, what they called, the externalist theories, they're called. Where the word psychology itself, the word mind, starts to mean something different. Not spooky and weird and superstitious, but it just refers to a different thing than that stuff that's locked inside your box of badly drawn bone. But, you know, what happens, you know, perception is part of psychology. And the object being perceived is as much part of the minding processes as anything else. I guess I'm looking at someone like Max Vellman's here, Reflexive Monism, where he talks about this. Or on a completely different key, something like Jung. You know, I'm a big fan of Jung and the people who followed him, people like James Hillman, coming out of psychoanalysis, looking at myths and stories and the collective unconscious, which sounds spooky, but doesn't have to be spooky at all. Could just be this, couldn't it? We could be in the collective unconscious, me and you and me. Lots and lots of things to do. Porridge, see? Porridge has become symbolic in the collective unconscious of my mind, which you are now part of, because look, our collective unconscious is in the media, and this is now brain stuff. So when this appears on the face of a badly articulated rabbit in the future, you'll know, because you are sharing in this collective unconscious moment. You will have a similar symbolic relationship to porridge or something. Anyway, that's that. As you can see, it's done. It's delicious. I'm starving, and I've talked for long enough. Bye.